fact. Despite the fact that it's so incredibly popular, of course, as will not be a surprise to many people in this room, very few people actually are aware of what precisely yoga is. And this is true for individuals who have just started yoga. This is even true for many yoga teachers who have been practicing it for 30 years, interestingly. And this is true especially in the Western world, where when we hear the term yoga, usually the first thing that comes to mind is something purely physical. You know, we tend to think of something that's the equivalent of what I call the aerobics of India. You know, basically just a way of keeping physically fit via various what I call asanas, exercises that are meant to give flexibility, etc. This is what most people think of when they think about yoga. And this is true in the Western world. Unfortunately, this is becoming increasingly true in India as well. You know, at one time there was a broader understanding in India of what yoga is, but now even in India, yoga is becoming the aerobics of India, unfortunately. So we see kind of a degeneration of this understanding of what precisely is yoga. Well, what we're going to talk about today, among other things, is we'll be talking about what precisely is yoga, what is the place of yoga within the greater context of Sanatana Dharma. We're going to be talking about the philosophy of yoga, and then afterwards we're going to be talking about ethics a little bit as well, and I have a few handouts for that afterwards. First, dealing with yoga. In order to understand yoga and what precisely is yoga, let's first look at the very word itself, yoga. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit verb root yuj, meaning to bring together, to unite. That in itself gives us a very clear indication of what the word itself means. Yoga essentially means union. If you had to give it a perfect, pure translation, yoga would mean union. Now, union in what sense of the term? Well, there are three primary senses in which we use this term, yoga as union. And let me go through these senses somewhat briefly. And in looking at these three senses of the term union, I think this will give us a greater understanding of what is the purpose, as well as a little bit of the philosophy of yoga, but especially the purpose of yoga. The first aspect in which we have this word yoga or union is union in the individual person. Now, as I say this, you know, this may not make a lot of sense to people. I mean, what does it mean for each of us as an individual to have union in our personhood, in our personality? Well, of course, the thing is, when we look at ourselves, when we think about ourselves in a very basic sort of sense, we tend to think of ourselves as unitary beings. You know, we look in the mirror, what do we see? We don't see five of ourselves, we see one. We see one person, one being. Well, despite appearances, the truth of the matter is, what yoga philosophy teaches us is that when you look at the individual person, you're not looking at merely one thing, but rather you're looking at several different elements that come together to make that one individual human person. Okay? So what are some of these elements? Well, again, according to yoga philosophy, but also Hindu philosophy in general. Of course, there's the body, there's the most obvious part, you know, again, that which you see when you look in the mirror. But more than this, we know that we also have a mind. And mind substance itself is different from bodily substance. How do we know this? Well, they can be separated. One can be active while the other is not, you know. More than mind, there is another element called intellect, what in Sanskrit is called buddhi. This word buddhi comes from the same verb root, buddh, from which we get the term Buddha. It simply means intellect. There are several meanings of the term actually, but we'll deal with the most obvious term, buddhi, meaning intellect. We also see that we are beings who have emotions. You know, I mean, who here does not have emotions? And we often see that emotions are a very powerful thing, a very strong thing. They often have the ability to overrule every other aspect of ourselves. We see that the human person also, of course, has ego, what is called ego, or ahankara in Sanskrit. And let me stop there for 1 second and explain precisely what is meant by the term ego. Because we hear this term all the time. Everyone uses this term. You know, it's, again, one of these terms that is used in philosophy, in popular spirituality, in such a general, such a generic sense, such an all-encompassing sense, to the point where it has almost become meaningless. Kind of like talking, it's kind of like using the word spiritual. You know, the word spiritual has been overused to the point where it's almost become meaningless. You know, meaning anything from the most profound metaphysical realization that a person can have to someone saying, my God, that cheesecake was so delicious, it was almost a spiritual experience. You know, we use the word just so broadly that it's become meaningless. Well, ego is one of those words that has been kind of overused. But let me explain precisely what is meant by ego before we go any deeper. What is meant by ego is not merely a sense of self, because to have a sense of self is natural to the soul. If you didn't have a sense of self, you would not be a conscious being. You would not be exhibiting consciousness, which is itself the primary attribute of the soul. Okay? So you have to have a sense of self. If you don't have a sense of self, then rather than being an animate being, you're an inanimate being. Rather than being a being who has consciousness, you're a being who does not have consciousness. Okay? So having a healthy sense of self is good. That's something that, again, is a natural attribute of self, of soul. However, when we use the term ego, or what is in Sanskrit called ahankara, what we're talking about is a mistaken sense of self. Okay? What we're talking about is an illusory sense of self. When we use the term ego, really what is a better term is false ego. That's actually a better term, but we'll just use the term ego for now. What we are talking about is the phenomena that occurs when the true self mistakenly thinks that something else is it. Okay? How do we know when someone is crazy? I mean, what is one characteristic? You know, we have these, in popular culture, we have, this picture of the person who thinks he's Napoleon. So he's in a straitjacket. Okay? Well, why is the person considered to have a mental illness? Well, he is identifying with something he is not. If a person starts to walk around and say, I am Jesus Christ, or I am Napoleon, or I am the President of the United States, and they're not, well, we know that there's something wrong, because they are identifying with something that they are not. Well, spiritually speaking, this is what ego is. This is what ahankara is essentially the same principle. When instead of identifying with pure self, we identify with literally anything that is not that pure self, that is false ego. Okay? Now, getting back to yoga in the sense of unity and this first instance that we're talking about. Now, seeing all of these various components that make up the human person, and of course, let me not forget the last one, which is Atman, which is pure self. Okay? Now, looking at these various components, what we often see is that in the individual person, these various components of what we are, instead of working in harmony with one another, are at war with one another. Okay? You know, very often our body wants to do something that our intellect knows we don't want to do. You know, like the example that I like to give. The body wants that third piece of cheesecake. The intellect says, no, you shouldn't have it. There's no reason to have that. You know, it's not going to be healthy for you. But the body wants it and will eat it anyway. You know, the senses overrule the intellect. Or in some cases, emotion can overrule the intellect. We're in a particular situation where we know we should not lose our temper. You know, so again, the intellect, the buddhi, is saying, no, don't lose your temper, but the emotions have their own course of action, and we lose our temper. So we see how these various components of what we are often don't cooperate. They almost seem to be, in many cases, at war with one another. Well, this is the first sense in which we have this term unity, yoga as unity, is unity within the individual person, you know, and bringing these various components of what we are together, working in harmony with one another. The second sense in which we have this word yoga as unity is unity between ourselves and the divine. Okay? Unity between ourselves and the divine. This is certainly the most important sense in which we have this term, yoga as unity. Of course, in actuality, in fact, let me ask people, you know, you've heard me talk about this very specifically. Are we really disunited from God in the real sense? No, we're not. We're not. The truth of the matter is, having a disconnect between ourselves and God is impossible. It's actually an impossibility. However, what can we have?
Illusion.
Yes, exactly. We can have the illusion of separation. Thus, yoga is employed to rid ourselves of that illusion and to, again, realize, we can say re-realize our connection, our unity with the divine, with God. Okay? And I won't go much deeper into the second sense because we've talked about that quite a bit and will continue to in the future. Now, the third sense in which we are striving for unity is unity between ourselves and other beings as well. You know, it's interesting. With all three of these senses of, let's state this in the negative, of disunity, what do we find? We find conflict within ourselves. We find conflict or disunity between ourselves and God. Also conflict and disunity between ourselves and other beings. When we look in the world around us, when we look at history, when we look at politics, geopolitics, when we look at all sorts of social phenomena that have occurred in every society on earth since the beginning of history, what do we find? Conflict. We find some people treating others badly. We find wars. We find greed. You know, we find all sorts of social clashes that take place. Well, why is this the case? There is, of course, a sense of disunity between ourselves and others. That disunity itself caused by ego, caused by false identification on our part and then on the part of others. So the third sense in which we have yoga as unity is unity between ourselves and then all beings, all of God's creation. Okay? All right. Now, having said this, let's define yoga a little bit better. There are many important textbooks that deal with yoga philosophy. Of these important textbooks, the most important, very specifically, are Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras. And I'm sure everyone has heard Bhagavad Gita. People forget this sometimes, but the Bhagavad Gita is primarily a yoga textbook. It is a textbook on yoga, more so than anything else. How do we know this? Well, it's all Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita. But the Bhagavad Gita being a dialogue, a discussion between Krishna and Arjuna, what we see is that the entire point of the Bhagavad Gita is the discussion of yoga and discussing again and again what are the various kinds of yoga, how do we practice yoga, what are the distinctions between the various forms of yoga, etc. And this makes it very specifically a yoga text. But then we have the Yoga Sutras, which also is a very important yoga text, and which most people who practice yoga probably more firmly identify with, maybe if only because it's called the Yoga Sutras. So therefore the word yoga is in the title. Now in the Yoga Sutras is written by Patanjali, very important philosopher in the history of Hinduism. And he defines yoga himself in the second verse of the first pada, the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras. Yogash chitta vritti nirodha, he says. He defines yoga in this way. Yoga is the stilling of the modifications of the mind. It's the stilling of the modifications of the mind. Okay? This is his actual definition. And again, Patanjali being one of the greatest authorities on yoga in history. Now, dealing with this definition, let's talk about this definition a little bit. And again, we don't have to go too in depth because we've talked about a little bit of this already. Now, when we use the word mind in this instance, we're talking about more than simply mind element, because the word that he uses very specifically is chitta. And what chitta means is not merely mind alone, but mind substance. In other words, anything that occurs on the mental or psychic level. Okay? So not merely mind. What the goal of yoga is, in this sense, is the stilling, the gaining control over all of these subtle aspects of ourselves. Okay? And the goal being two things: self-realization and God realization. These are the two goals of yoga. All right? Now, How do we know this? Well, Patanjali says this. He talks about kevalam, he talks about self-realization, that he uses the word kevalam very specifically, meaning separation of true self from anything that is not self. But also he talks very specifically about God, who he terms Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras. And he talks about a term, Ishvara Pranidhana, devotion to God. Okay? Now, having said this, with these two goals in mind, of self-realization and God-realization, what is interesting is the Yoga Sutras themselves only focus on the former and not the latter. They focus on self-realization. And that is the entire purpose of the Yoga Sutras. The goal is, the purpose of the Yoga Sutras themselves are not God-realization, but self-realization. This is why, unfortunately, individuals who get very heavily into yoga, who focus exclusively on the Yoga Sutras alone, are not going to achieve the goal, the full goal of yoga. Again, within the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali is very implicit about the two goals, self-realization, God-realization, but then he himself only talks about self-realization. For God-realization, textually speaking, scripturally speaking, you then have to go to other scriptures, including Bhagavad Gita, and then there are other scriptures that deal specifically with the yoga of God-realization, such as Narada Bhakti Sutras, Shandilya Bhakti Sutras, and several other texts like this. Okay? Actually, yes, there is an exact sequence. You must have self-realization first, and then God-realization. It's literally an impossibility because it defies logic to do the opposite. In order to have knowledge of God, you first have to have knowledge of self. In order to have knowledge of that which is the greatest object of knowledge, first you have to know the knower. You know, now this is not true empirically. In other words, you know, a person can have knowledge that, you know, such and such is a red brick without self-realization. You know, but then spiritually speaking, it's the opposite. One must know who is the knower before you can know that which is the highest transcendent reality. You know, so yeah, it has to progress in that order. And what we see is throughout the history of successful yogis who follow the complete system and achieve God realization, it always progresses in that sequence. That first you have what's called Atman realization, realization of self. But then you have realization of what's called Paramatman, the supreme self, that which is higher than even the self, in other words, God. Yeah, so it progresses in that order, Atman and then Paramatman, realization. Yeah, because again, you know, you have to know who is the knower. You have to know first your own experience of consciousness before you can then know the origin of all consciousness. Again, getting back to this misconception about what is yoga itself, and this idea that people have in the Western world, that it's a purely physical thing. The truth of the matter is, the physical aspect of yoga, strictly speaking, is 1/8 of the entire yoga system. The entire yoga system itself is termed Ashtanga, Ashtanga yoga. What that means very simply, Ashta means 8, Anga means limbs. The full yoga system has 8 limbs. Okay? And we're going to discuss these 8 limbs just somewhat briefly. We won't go very in depth into this, but somewhat briefly. The first 2 of these limbs of yoga are yama and niyama. These are the first 2. These are the ethical prescriptions and proscriptions of not just yoga, but Sanatana Dharma itself. In other words, if you could say that there were 10 commandments in Hinduism, these are them. These are kind of like the 10 commandments of yoga. And in a little while, when we talk about the ethics of Hinduism, we'll talk about each one of these, so we won't talk about them right now. Okay? Next, there is asana. Asana. Now, asana is the physical aspect of yoga. So again, when you take the typical yoga class, probably 90% of what you do is in fact asana. However, asana itself is 1/8 of the entire yoga system. It's only a small part of the entire yoga system. But it's an important part of the yoga system. All right? Next, there's pranayama. Pranayama. What that is very simply breathing exercises. Breathing exercises, but with a very specific goal, and you are working with a very specific aspect of breath. You are working very specifically with what is called prana, or the life force. The life force is something which is recognized universally. This is not just a Hindu idea. If anyone here has studied Chinese philosophy or medicine or anything like this, it's termed qi in Chinese, as in Tai Chi. Okay? And qi is the exact same concept as prana. The idea is that there is an enervating energy that is present within what's called vayu, within the life airs that exist. And by accessing this, we have the ability to energize ourselves, to calm ourselves, to gain mystic powers, etc. So this is prana, pranayama. All right. Next, there's pratyahara. Pratyahara. What this is withdrawing of the senses, control of the senses. And very specifically, when it comes to pratyahara, sometimes people have, again, misconception about what precisely is meant by that term. By withdrawal of the senses, what is meant is not just some artificial kind of cutting off of the senses. It's something much more profound than that. It's the idea of the interiorization of consciousness. In other words, right now our awareness tends to be external. You know, our awareness tends to be external. We're constantly aware of external things. In fact, very often, even when we meditate, what we find is that, you know, to our frustration, we're still aware of external things. We'll still hear noises in the background, you know. We'll still feel our body, you know. We're still aware of external things. Well, the idea of pratyahara is taking that awareness and making it internal. Very simple. Okay? Next comes dharana. Dharana. Dharana means very simply concentration. Concentration. And there are some very specific yoga exercises that are done in order to build concentration. Another word for concentration is focus. Focus. Focus is something that is crucial to any important endeavor. If we want to achieve anything of importance in life, we have to have focus. You know, if you look at any great person in history, even, any person who even achieved anything to give themselves material fame, you know, a great general or whoever, you know, great philosopher, one thing that you notice is that they have great focus. They have the ability to focus on one thing like a laser beam. And that is a key to success, not just in worldly matters, but also in yoga as well. In yoga and in meditation. All right? Next, there is dhyana. Dhyana is meditation itself, meditation proper. As far as meditation, I think we've discussed what precisely meditation is. Meditation being very simply conscious awareness of a specific thing, but something spiritual, to be even more specific. Concentration on awareness of Atman, of self, awareness of God within the heart. That's meditation proper. Finally, there is samadhi. Samadhi. Now, samadhi means complete absorption in the absolute. Complete absorption of one's awareness in the divine. Samadhi sometimes is translated as trance, and I hate that word because it makes it sound like the yogi is a medium or something, you know, going to commune with the next world or something like that. Yogis don't go into trance. Rather, they go into samadhi. With samadhi, and there's salvikalpa, nirvikalpa samadhi. There are two forms of samadhi. With samadhi, the ultimate goal, the ultimate idea of samadhi is complete absorption of one's awareness in the divine, such that any separation between ourselves and the divine cease to exist. Awareness of any separation. Okay? It's not that we become God, but there's, this awareness of separation simply ceases to exist. The way that it's described, and this is the goal of yoga and of life, actually. The way that it's described is, you can imagine the times in your life when you've been in love with someone, and you are so in love with that person to the point where all that you are is aware of them. And any separation between your awareness and that person ceases to exist. Now, is it a fact that both of you do cease to exist as separate entities? No, of course not. That person you're in love with is still a separate person. You are still you. However, your awareness of that separation has ceased to exist. Okay? This is Samadhi. This is how we experience Samadhi, this absorption in the Absolute. All right? Now, let's talk a little bit more in depth as far as what precisely is the relationship of yoga with Sanatana Dharma. And this is actually a very important topic. It's something very, very important for people to understand. Because what we see is that in America today, there are anywhere from 18 to 20 million individuals practicing yoga on a regular basis. Not just dabbling with it, but practicing it regularly, meaning taking at least one yoga class a week. Yoga has become extremely popular throughout the Western world. It always has been, actually, ever since the first awareness of yoga in the Western world in the 19th century. It has been practiced and has been practiced by many, many people. Incredibly famous celebrities all throughout time, actually, not just today, not just the Madonnas of the world, but celebrities of almost every generation for the past 130 years or so have practiced yoga. Great philosophers have practiced yoga. Again, it's something that has been extremely popular for a long time. Certainly in the last 30, 40 years, it's become even more popular. However, despite its popularity, unfortunately, many people tend to see a disconnect between yoga itself as a discipline versus its actual origins, which is Sanatana Dharma, which is Hinduism. And it's to the point where people have tried artificially today to quite literally divorce yoga from its roots, from its origins, and say that, oh no, yoga has nothing to do with Hinduism, it's just its own kind of thing, it's a universal sort of concept, and we can even create a Christian yoga, Jewish yoga, Muslim yoga, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is, no, you can't. You cannot. I'm going to state this as emphatically as possible. Yoga is Hinduism, and Hinduism is yoga. When you are practicing yoga, even if you're doing it at the YMCA, you are practicing Hinduism. You may not want to acknowledge that. You may want to say, no, I'm doing Christian yoga or Jewish yoga or whatever. You are not. It would be the equivalent of going to a Catholic church and taking communion and saying, well, this is a Hindu communion. No, it's not. No, it's not. It is a Catholic or a Lutheran or whatever the particular church's communion. Yoga itself is the spiritual discipline of Hinduism. And let me explain what is meant by this. Any individual who basically subscribes to Hindu philosophical principles can call themselves Hindu. Okay? To call yourself Hindu is a very easy thing. To call yourself Hindu, you don't really have to do much. Essentially, all you have to do is just that, call yourself Hindu. However, historically, when it comes to the point that an individual who considers himself Hindu now wants to take Hinduism seriously and wants to now begin to practice Hinduism with, again, this goal of self-realization and God realization, there is one thing and only one thing that religious Hindu will then do, and that is practice yoga. Okay? So yoga itself is very much the spiritual discipline par excellence of Hinduism. When a person is practicing Hinduism in a disciplined sort of way, they are practicing yoga. So yoga itself, we can say, is really the very heart of Hinduism. Okay? Now, going a little bit deeper, with yoga itself, the heart of yoga is meditation. The heart of yoga is meditation. And it is meditation that is the glue that keeps together all of these various aspects of the yoga system. Even asana, interestingly, even the physical aspect, even when you go to a local yoga class here and there, and you take an hour and a half long class, and essentially for most of that time you just go from one asana to another asana to another asana. Ideally speaking, in the traditional authentic system of yoga, even when you're doing asanas, the idea is to do them in such a way that it's a meditative experience. So every single aspect of yoga, including the 8 aspects that I mentioned, and truthfully there are many more than just these 8 aspects, but dealing just with these 8 aspects alone, they are all meant to be done both as a form of meditation, but also to support meditation. Traditionally, even the asanas, the reason why yogis began doing asanas was certainly to keep physically fit, but also there were some aspects that were much deeper than just keeping physically fit. The idea also was to prepare oneself for being able to sit for long periods of time in order to do meditation. Also, the third aspect, which is also a subtle aspect, is that the asanas themselves, when properly done, affect not just the physical body, but actually condition the, let's say, for lack of a better term, the astral body, or the subtle body, the psychic body. So interestingly, many of these asanas you can feel physically, certainly, but more than that, they're actually affecting you on an energetic level as well. Okay? Very good. The idea of liberation is not, it's not like in the Western world where the idea is that it's simply an after-death sort of state, but you can achieve liberation while being in the physical body. So for example, you have someone like the Buddha who achieved nirvana, but obviously he didn't die immediately afterwards. Having achieved nirvana, he then comes back to external consciousness, and then he teaches for decades after that. And we have many instances of yogis who are like this. You have, in fact, very specifically, you have Shukadeva, who is a very good example. One individual, Shukadeva Goswami, who lived about 5,000 years ago. He was the son of Vyasa, the son of one of the great rishis, one of the most important rishis. Shukadeva was actually born enlightened. He was born Brahman realized. So what to speak of not having a body, being a self-realized person. He already was a self-realized person and took up a body, but did so very specifically in order to help the world. So all throughout his life, even as a child, even as a teenager, he was someone who was a self-realized being, but yet he had a physical body. And then you have less dramatic instances of this, individuals who will gain self-realization, God realization, but the idea is not that you then die immediately afterwards. Otherwise we'd have yogis, dying left and right all the time as soon as they have liberation. But no, you remain within your body. In fact, this concept is called Jivan Mukta. Jivan Mukta. The idea that you are still embodied, but you are a mukta, a liberated being. And as far as the Savikalpa, Nirvikalpa, Samadhi, Patanjali himself talks about this. These are the 2 stages of Samadhi. The first stage being the stage in which you still perceive separation between yourself and the divine. But then with the latter stage of Samadhi, that perception disappears. There is, as I like to state it, there is no via medium. There's nothing in between you and God. This also is the stage of the rishi as well. We talked several weeks ago about how knowledge of the divine, how knowledge of God, how spiritual knowledge is transmitted to the individual who has self-realization, but then also how that person transmits that knowledge to others. You remember we discussed how is it that we know anything? There's a medium. There's a tool that we use. How do I know that there is a cup of water on the table? I use the medium of my eye. But then, how do we know God very specifically? The way that we know God very specifically is that for the rishi, for the self-realized being, there is no medium. The medium disappears. All that there is the knower, and then that transcendent object of knowledge, which is God. but then with quite literally nothing in between. Well, this also describes the Samadhi state, in which there is no medium, there is no, in other words, perception of differentiation. So when we have this mystical experience, well, in Latin is called unio mystico, this idea of mystical union that you find in almost every spiritual tradition on earth, this idea of, in other words, oneness with the divine. This is how this is explained, that the perception of difference dissolves. Now, there still is difference. There still is, there has to always still be a de facto, sense of separation and identification that I am me, I am the knower, and God, of course, also having the sense of I am me. That has to be there because, again, it's a natural attribute of consciousness. But at the same time, the perception of that disappears. On the part of the individual who is experiencing it, the way that that person knows is, in fact, it's described very specifically the same way that you know that you're in love. When you are in love with someone, it's so radically personal an experience and so overwhelming an experience that the very vividness of that experience itself is proof to oneself that you're experiencing it. So that's how the individual knows. As far as how we ourselves know whether X person is self-realized, how do you know when something is fire? It gives off the properties of fire. If we claim that such and such is fire, if I claim that this is fire, and it doesn't give off the properties of fire, those properties being primarily heat and then light, then it's not fire. But then on the other hand, if we see something that fits those two properties, then it's fire. Then it's fire. And it has to be both properties. It can't just be one. So for example, we have light bulbs. They have light, but they don't necessarily have the significant amount of heat to make them fire. In the same way, the way that we know whether someone is self-realized or not is to understand what are the characteristics of an individual who is self-realized. And there are many characteristics of a person who is self-realized, the first of which, and the primary of which, is that that individual is thoroughly absorbed in the divine. Now let's take this a little bit deeper. Anyone can say that they're perfectly absorbed in the divine. Again, the same question, how do you know? When a person is thoroughly absorbed in the divine, what this means is that then they have the ability to transmit that experience to others. They have the ability to transmit that experience to others. This is, again, a very traditional example that's given in the scriptures. If you, let's say you have a fire going. If you have a metal rod, you take that metal rod, you put it in the fire. Okay? After some time, you take that metal rod out of the fire. Is it still a metal rod? Yeah, it's still a metal rod. You can even see that it's a metal rod. It has the shape of a metal rod. However, it is now fire. How do you know that? Number one, it's glowing like fire. Number two, you touch it to something, it has the same effect as fire. You touch it to paper, it will burn. You touch it to a person, it will burn. So this is a perfect example of how you still have that differentiation. The iron rod remains an iron rod. However, it now is exhibiting the properties of fire. In the same way, the rishi remains a person, remains whoever they are. They remain an individual person with a certain height, with a certain weight, with a certain appearance, with a certain age, etc. But at the same time, they are now exhibiting the properties of God. They haven't become God, but they're exhibiting the properties of God. What does this mean? Now we go to the literally hundreds of properties that are described in the scriptures of an individual who has perfect samadhi. It means that they have overwhelming peace in themselves. It means that they have equanimity. It means that, like we were discussing with yoga, all the various aspects of who they are working in conjunction and in harmony. It means that they have compassion toward all beings. It means that they have wisdom. It means that their buddhi, that their wisdom faculty is awoken. To state it very specifically within the yoga system, once one's wisdom faculty, there's something called the wisdom faculty, once this is awoken, an individual has the ability to perceive truth in all things, and more to communicate that truth. And again, there are hundreds of properties like this of an individual who is a rishi. So if a person claims to be a self-realized person, they have to exhibit the qualities of a self-realized person. And for us specifically, the most important of those qualities being the ability to transmit that experience to others.